Hello everyone, welcome back to Sigil. My name is Kevbot, and this is the second episode in my series on the history of D&D, one book at a time, where I take an anthropological approach to understanding the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it. In this episode, I'm going to analyze the history of writing the first draft of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the formation of the company that would publish it, Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR. My focus in this episode will be on how Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson collaborated, or failed to collaborate, on writing the initial set of rules, and how Gary Gygax, Kaye, and Brian Blume worked together to start the company TSR to eventually publish D&D. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get started. We left off at the end of the last video in February 1973. Dave Arneson and Dave McGarry had driven down from the Twin Cities to Lake Geneva to show Gary Gygax both McGarry's Dungeons of Poshikata board game and Arneson's Blackmoor game to see if Gygax could convince Guidon Games to publish one or both of them. During the visit, they played Dungeons of Poshikata on the floor, and then Arneson ran Gygax, McGarry, and some of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association members through a Blackmoor adventure. The game ended in the early hours of the morning, and Gygax found it tremendously inspiring. Always being one to cooperate on game design, Gygax went to work on expanding Arneson's Blackmoor. Gygax was initially interested in Arneson's Blackmoor as he believed it to be a modification of chainmail, and wanted to include these modifications in the third printing of chainmail. However, after experiencing Blackmoor and realizing it was more than just a modification of chainmail, and in reality was an entirely new game, Gygax sensed a new product opportunity. And so, Gygax went to work on expanding Arneson's Blackmoor. Gygax requested that Arneson send his game notes for Blackmoor. However, Arneson never had any plans on publishing them as a game system, and only had about 18 pages of handwritten notes. Beginning the process of typing, revising, and expanding the rules he received, Gygax wrote to Arneson a few days later, taking your stuff a bit further. A player can begin at any class, warrior, magician, or cleric, where each of these classes has advantages and drawbacks. Gygax created 9 classes of fighter, 11 of magic users, and 7 of clerics. He added dozens of monsters, determined their hit dice, and worked on a table on average armor for hits. Along with beginning to write and expand the game, Gygax also started playtesting this new fantasy game with members of the LGTSA, notably Kaye, teenage brothers Rob and Terry Kuntz, and his children Elise and Ernie Gygax. These games centered on the free city of Greyhawk that Gygax added to the Great Kingdom map, a map that also contained the Blackmoor region that Arneson was simultaneously running and playtesting in the Twin Cities. Gygax drew up 12 dungeon levels, some covering 2 sheets of paper, and wrote that the chaps were so nuts about the game that most of my spare time has flown into levels and rules for an eventual campaign similar to yours. We have 11 players at this moment. Some notable characters in D&D history have their roots in this proto-playtesting, including Rob Kuntz's character Roblar, and Gygax's character of Yarg the Swordsman and Mordenkainen the Sorcerer. By the end of the year, the group had grown from 6 to 16 players. After a month of playtesting this new game, Gygax would write to Arneson in April of 1973 with a proposal for the two of them to work together towards writing and publishing the game. After Dungeon is produced, I do hope that Dave McGarry has sent the game off to Lowry. I'll whip out a booklet, Gygax and Arneson I Trust, for your approval, so groups can play their own games. Gygax decided that he would design and write the draft of the game, and run it by Arneson for approval before publication, crediting him as a co-author. Using the notes Arneson had sent Gygax from his home campaign, along with his night of playing with Arneson a few months earlier as a reference, Gygax would write the first draft of Dungeons & Dragons. Throughout 1973, Gygax would consistently write to Arneson, asking him to send more rules and concepts to include in the game. Could I have a copy of your Blackmoor rules, maps, and lower levels? I'll start on the campaign booklet soon. In another note, he would write, if you can spare me copies of your secret rules and level maps, it would be greatly appreciated. I'll then comment on our similarities and differences, and send copies of anything that I think you'd like. Arneson would send his game notes to Gygax throughout the year. However, the lack of coherency within them led to frustration on the part of Gygax. Arneson was not attempting to construct a coherent game system in his home game, so the notes he would send to Gygax lacked any sort of central overarching game system, and primarily consisted of scattered rulings on behalf of the referee. In an interview in Pegasus, Arneson said that he wrote up a set of rules as we went along. I kept track of my rules decisions in a big black notebook as we went along so I didn't contradict myself too often. Unfortunately, at that time, I visualized that I wouldn't have to keep track of all those records and maps. In Heroic Worlds, Arneson explained, the rules were not really an organized set, more notes on what I said earlier. This misunderstanding between Gygax and Arneson would lead to a friction between the two of them that lasted during the entire early design and writing process. As an example of this friction, Arneson sent Gygax a system for intelligent magic swords that could rebel if they differed in alignment from the player character. Gygax responded to this system by writing, I am highly impressed with your sword egotism and side preference, but I thought you'd do a better job meshing it with our LGTSA rules, as plagiarized from your rules, as drawn from chainmail. Gygax found himself consistently rewriting the notes that Arneson would send him to try to get them to fit within the D&D system, causing frustration on behalf of both Gygax and Arneson. Gygax for the extra work, and Arneson because he felt his ideas for the game were being ignored and excluded. Although this process was infuriating for Gygax, it seemed to stimulate his creativity in the same way that he had reacted to Jeff Perrin's medieval rules when writing Chainmail. By adopting and expanding Arneson's ideas, Gygax built a system inspired by Arneson's fragmentary rules and by his impression on playing Blackmoor that night in Lake Geneva. In the end, though, Gygax had it his way, just as he had overruled Mike Carr while writing Don't Give Up the Ship Together. In May 1973, Gygax wrote to Arneson, I'm at somewhere around 50 pages plus in the campaign rules, and the hard part is now before me. Paragraphs on how spells and magic items work, saving throws, and the monster descriptions are needed. He planned to complete those and send the draft to Arneson for his feedback. I'm really getting sick of the thing, for it is a grind. I'll be glad when I can flip it over to you. Add whatever you like, correct, rearrange my sequence, it is horrible, and do whatever else you think would be an improvement. Gygax would expand the draft to 100 pages, although he did not incorporate a majority of the fragments of system that Arneson had sent, including the aforementioned intelligent magical swords. Gygax finished the preliminary manuscript for D&D and dated it July 1st. At the time, Gygax intended this to be a single volume pamphlet in the style of chainmail, but over the course of the year, it would grow in scale and size to that of a 3-pamphlet volume. Not simply a 3rd edition of chainmail, this was a new and independent game, although it did make some references to chainmail. The mid-1973 manuscript was titled Dungeons and Dragons, a common tradition in the wargaming scene of naming X ampersand Y, such as Strategy and Tactics, Castle and Crusades, or Cavaliers and Roundheads. The origin of the name Dungeons and Dragons is a bit disputed. Gygax would recall that it was the enthusiastic approval given to the name from his youngest daughter Cindy that cemented his choice for it. However, other members of the Gygax family recall that it was actually his wife, Mary, who suggested it. The title page of the typed draft reads in full, Dungeons and Dragons, Rules for Fantastic Medieval Paper, Board, and Miniature Figure Campaign Games by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and pencil is handwritten after the word paper. The foreword of the first draft contains an explanation behind the collaboration that led to Dungeons and Dragons. From the chainmail fantasy rules, Arneson drew an expanded set of rules for battles and the campaign. Eventually, Dave made the mistake of letting me get my hands on his campaign, and the result is this booklet. Gygax would rephrase this in the final published foreword for Dungeons and Dragons. From the chainmail fantasy rules, Arneson drew ideas for a far more complex and exciting game, and thus began a campaign which still thrives as of this writing. In due course, the news reached my ears, and the result is what you have in your hands at this moment. This revised version gives more emphasis on the contributions of Arneson, even including a reference to his Blackmoor game. In these draft rules, Gygax reworked the core 5 character abilities to be intelligence, cunning, strength, health, and appearance. And these abilities would be generated by rolling 3d6. Players would choose to play as either a magic user, fighting man, or cleric, who could be a human, elf, or dwarf. No matter which class the player chose, hit points would be determined by a d6. Furthermore, when a character or monster dealt damage in combat, the damage would also be determined by a d6. The only exception to this rule would be for spells such as Fireball and Lightning Bolt, which would follow the rules from Chainmail. Any character that fails their saving throw against the spell would be killed outright. Roughly half of the draft is dedicated to descriptions of spells and magic items, with accompanying charts, and the other half is dedicated to character creation and advancement. This would include how to gather followers, build strongholds, and instructions for the referee on how to structure the underworld. These rules instruct the referee to draw out a minimum of a half a dozen levels of the underworld, people them with horde monsters, distribute prizes, and note the location of the 2 ladder items on a key. There's also a brief description on how to run the above ground adventure using Avalon Hill's outdoor survival. Sending the first draft to Arneson, Gygax wrote to do whatever you like with this and then ship it back, and we can fight about whose ideas are better. He admitted that it contained many mistakes and omissions, needing some sensible arrangement and a table of contents. He specifically asked Arneson to help with the sections on languages, on spells and research, and on magic weapons. Arneson and McGarry returned it with several notes on each page, along with a page-by-page commentary with their critiques. McGarry would also write the table of contents. Arneson and McGarry noted that the concept of the prime requisite needed an explanation on what prime requisites are, and more importantly, how they will be used. In the combat rules on page 22, McGarry noted, hits equal to a die roll, 1 to 6, Y. It is interesting to see how some of these foundational concepts of role-playing games that seem obvious to players today were novel to these wargamers. Along with clarifications, Arneson also proposed some additions. For the mummy, he wrote, possible as mummy kills, it becomes more and more lifelike, and eventually looks normal, and keeps it up by absorbing victim's life into its own body. Arneson and McGarry would send this draft with their notes back to Gygax, and, following the 1973 Gen Con, Gygax redoubled his efforts to complete the final version of Dungeons & Dragons. Arneson sent Gygax additional material as well, but Gygax responded with a letter on August 22, 1973, frustrated that it didn't contain a sword matrix revision or a usable set of naval rules. In the same letter, Gygax complained, if you won't do them from scratch, we can drop detailed mention of them. A month later, still dissatisfied with the naval rules, Gygax would write to Arneson on September 27, 1973, if necessary, don't make complete naval rules, just do an outline, for something is better than nothing. While Gygax would complain about Arneson's lack of contributions to the game system during this period, Arneson would complain that he felt he had no control over the direction of the game. Arneson would later write, it was very much a case of me providing various ideas and concepts, but not having any say as to how they would be used, and I was not consulted on many aspects of the final work. One of these disagreements concerned the idea of hit points for characters. Gygax favored characters gaining hit points as they gain levels, and Arneson wanted to fix character hit points at their starting values, but make higher level characters more difficult to hit. As early as 1974, Arneson wrote in Great Plains Game Player Newsletter 16 about the communication breakdown and mix-up regarding some aspects of the final product and places where Gygax deviated from Arneson's ideas and contributions. Part of this was due to the distance between Arneson and the Twin Cities and Gygax in Lake Geneva, the high cost of long-distance phone calls, and limitations of postal communication. Gygax acknowledged Arneson's displeasure, writing that Arneson complained bitterly that the game wasn't right, but proceeded with the design as he saw fit. Arneson would write that when it came to the final draft of D&D, I did not see it before it went to press. In spite of these disagreements between Gygax and Arneson, and troubles regarding communication, Arneson continued sending notes and materials to Gygax all throughout 1973. However, Gygax could not refrain from complaining to Arneson about the materials he was receiving. On December 27, 1973, Gygax wrote to Arneson that all 3 fantasy booklets are done on my end of things, and they were getting ready for proofing and printing. In reference to Arneson's lack of coherent naval system, Gygax wrote, I had to alter both the air and sea rules considerably, Dave, in order to make them homogeneous with the balance of the old rules. How about that? Dave, let's keep this kind of old stuff in mind when we're doing a set of rules, huh? We do want a set of rules that has an internal harmony, now don't we? It isn't nice to design totally different rules for aspects of the same game, is it? No. The end result of this year-long collaborative project between Gygax and Arneson would be a 3-volume set with accommodating reference sheets. Some of the major changes since the first draft include characters having 6 ability scores: Strength, Intelligence, Dexterity, Wisdom, Constitution, and Charisma. Spells like Fireball now dealt hit points of damage, and many new spells were added, including classics like Sleep. There's also an expanded list of monsters, including the cleanup crew of Ochre Jelly, Black Pudding, Green Slime, Grey Ooze, and Yellow Mold. However, there were still major aspects of the game that ended up missing in the initial printing. There was no description of combat in the final rules, and in some places, revisions of the text are haphazardly implemented. A reference to the medallions, stones, gems, or bracelets that can control elementals refers to the draft names of those magical items, instead of the censer, stone brazier, and bowl listed in the magic items chart. In the end, it was clear that this was meant to be more of a framework of rules than an entirely fleshed out system, and the system would end up being fleshed out more in the coming years. Gygax initially intended to publish Dungeons & Dragons through Don Lowry's Guide on Games. He even signed the foreword as Guide on Games Miniature Rules Editor. Guide on Games promised a path to publishing not just Dungeons & Dragons, but also Dave McGarry's Dungeons of Pashikata. However, it would soon become obvious that this would not be possible. In November 1972, Don Lowry moved Guide on Games out to Belfast, Maine, and invited Gygax to move to Maine as well. Gygax spent most of 1973 considering it, and even told Arneson to consider doing so, but he inevitably decided to stay in Lake Geneva. In part, Gygax's reluctance to move out to Maine was based on his skepticism that the move would be economically viable for Guide on Games. He wrote to Arneson, "I'll be hanging on here yet, until we see how he does in 6 months to a year." Sure enough, the move away from his main customer base proved disastrous for Don Lowry. Compounded by the economic downturn of 1973, brought on by inflation, high oil prices, the Vietnam War, and financial burdens of the Cold War, general sales for hobbies took a massive hit. And by mid 1973, Lowry had laid off most of his employees from Guide on Games. By August 1973, it was clear that Guide on Games would be in no position to publish either McGarry's The Dungeons of Pashikata or Gygax and Arneson's Dungeons & Dragons. This was even in spite of a favorable impression of the Dungeons of Pashikata. In a 1975 issue of Panzerfaust, Lowry reported, "David R. McGarry designed this game and offered it to us to publish about 2 years ago. We were very impressed with it, but unfortunately didn't have the capital to publish it then, so we returned it to him." As for Dungeons & Dragons, Gygax would later recall, "As Lowry's miniature rules editor, I urged him to immediately publish the game, for I viewed it as something really new and different, and envisioned it as having great potential. Don turned it down." Though he would have been in a better position to publish the 3-volume pamphlet of Dungeons & Dragons than the board game for McGarry's Dungeon, Lowry passed on publishing D&D, as he believed no one would want to create their own dungeons. Gygax did not shy away from making his thoughts about Don Lowry's move to Maine and failure of Guide on Games known. In the letter Gygax wrote to Arneson when sending him the first draft of D&D, regarding Don Lowry, he would write, "Don is overwhelmed and planning to pull in his horns. The stupid move to Maine is just catching up to him, and he says he's hurting. Production will be slowed." With Guide on Games out of the picture, who else could publish Dungeons & Dragons? At this time, few companies other than Guide on Games even dared to sell rules for miniature wargames at all, as traditionally, these rules were published for free in wargaming zines or given away for free when buying sets of miniature figures. For many wargamers at the time, just the thought of buying wargaming rules at all was a controversial notion. This problem became even worse for Gygax as the manuscript for Dungeons & Dragons quickly grew from a single chainmail-sized booklet into a full 3-volume set of booklets, which would not only make the rules for sale, but also make them expensive. One potential publisher would be Avalon Hill, who specialized in board wargames. Gygax had a couple of connections within Avalon Hill that he would try to leverage to get them to publish D&D. Don Greenwood, editor of the wargaming newsletter Panzerfaust, that Gygax had previously written for, and Tom Shaw, who was heavily involved in Gen Con. Gygax also knew that Avalon Hill was looking for new and innovative games, as the board wargaming market was beginning to grow stale by 1973. As Tom Shaw would write in 1973, "The wargame today is still much the same as it was in 1952. It is my opinion that we have today far too many games on the market that are rehashes of old formulas. I've seen nothing startling new in over a decade." However, even with these connections, Avalon Hill would pass on publishing both D&D and Dungeons of Pashikata. Even though Dungeons of Pashikata fell closely in line with other Avalon Hill products, being a board game, they were turned off from the fantasy aspect of it. Gygax would later write, "I mentioned D&D to Avalon Hill, but the reception was a trifle chilly. The establishment was not about to jump into something as different and controversial as fantasy. Neither D&D nor McGarry's Dungeon were saleable commodities. Gygax claimed that Avalon Hill laughed at the idea when he presented Dungeons and Dragons to them. Avalon Hill would counter that D&D was never presented to Avalon Hill for publication, but conceded that it is doubtful that they would have published it had the opportunity arose. It was so foreign to the marketing philosophy of Avalon Hill at the time. Gygax did mention to Avalon Hill the connection between Dungeons and Dragons and their outdoor survival title, but to no avail. It became clear that if Gygax wanted to publish Dungeons and Dragons, he would need to do it himself. In a letter to McGarry dated August 2nd, 1973, Gygax wrote, "Now then, some of us here are getting a bit of loot together in order to produce our own wargame rules. As for McGarry's Dungeons of Pashikata," Gygax continued, "if you can't hack production of Dungeon yourself, please keep us in mind." Gygax believed that he didn't need Lowry's help to publish the game, and even criticized him in the same letter, writing that Lowry fools around and isn't a driver. "I've done one hell of a lot of spade work for him, I might as well do it for myself. And Lowry will still market our stuff anyways." Gygax believed that he could get enough loot together to at least enter the market by creating a small miniature wargame rules business, capitalizing on the market vacancy left behind by the soon-defunct Guidon Games, and use the profits from that to produce other titles, such as McGarry's Dungeon board game. Two things that Gygax had going for him in the early days of this venture was his reputation and connections from the previous years of publishing rules and games, in both fanzines and through Guidon Games, as well as the annual Gen Con. Lowry wrote in Panzerfaust that Gen Con brought not only 400 gamers, but also miniature figure casters, hobby store owners, and distributors. Gen Con became a place to demonstrate new games to a wide array of gamers who could bring these games back to their hometowns and spread them from there. Following the collapse of the IFW, the LGTSA took control of Gen Con starting in 1973. If the LGTSA could operate a convention at the scale of Gen Con, this would inspire confidence in their ability to also venture into game rules publishing. And for Gygax, he would be able to promote games published through his new company by demonstrating them at Gen Con. September 4th, 1973, Gygax wrote to Arneson, "We're getting ready to roll." Gygax's close childhood friend and fellow wargamer, Don Kaye, invested $1,000 he withdrew from his life insurance into this new partnership with Gygax, and Tactical Studies Rules was formed. In this partnership, Kaye would control the money, and Gygax would write the rules. The name Tactical Studies Rules was named in honor of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, a gaming group both Gygax and Kaye were members of, and the initials of the TSR logo was an intertwined G and K. The business model for TSR was heavily influenced by that of Guidon Games, and they sought to use Don Kaye's initial investment to cover the cost of incorporating and publishing a single set of miniature wargames rules. However, this first set of rules would not be Dungeons and Dragons. Throughout 1973, it became clear that Dungeons and Dragons would far exceed the length of a single pamphlet, like chainmail. Its scope had expanded to a point where it would require 3 Guidon-sized pamphlets, similar to the game Tractics, and this simply exceeded the capabilities of TSR's meager initial investment of Don Kaye's $1,000. This issue of scale, along with the novel idea of the game itself, made Dungeons and Dragons both an impractical and risky product for TSR to publish first. So, they decided to print a smaller scale and more familiar set of traditional wargaming rules based in the English Civil War called Cavaliers and Roundheads, with the hope that this release would both establish the credibility of TSR within the miniature wargame publishing sphere and raise the required capital needed to print Dungeons and Dragons. Gygax explained this process to Arneson in a letter dated September 27, 1973. "Depending on how well sales go, we will increase or cut back production. 6 releases per year could be possible, as could only 1 or 2 new booklets be possible due to money. Let's hope for the best." To help with marketing and promoting the game, Cavaliers and Roundheads was another collaboration between Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin, as the two had previously collaborated on the commercially proven and popular chainmail set of wargaming rules. Cavaliers and Roundheads was mainly written by Perrin. Gygax refers to his contributions as trifling in the introduction, but they made sure to include Perrin and Gygax on the cover to properly cash in on the recognition that their previous success and collaboration together with chainmail generated. The illustrations in Cavaliers and Roundheads would be completed by Greg Bell a teenage wargamer and fellow member of the Castle and Crusade Society, who occasionally played wargames with Perrin and Gygax. His art style, a blocky rendering of strong shapes and lines, would translate well to the crude printing process TSR could afford. The design of Cavaliers and Roundheads mirrored the look of other Guide on Games publications, a single digest-sized booklet they planned to sell for $3. Using his connections within the wargaming community, Gygax approached wholesale buyers for TSR's debut offering. Initially, the plan seemed successful. Cavaliers and Roundheads attracted some promising pre-orders from the distributor Jack Scrooby and Jim Odin of Heritage. Jack Scrooby, the father of miniature wargaming in America, had been working with Gygax on a line of fantasy miniatures for chainmail that would carry over to Dungeons & Dragons. As for Heritage, they would go on to become one of TSR's best early customers, even well into the 1980s. Although Cavaliers and Roundheads sold well initially, like most board wargames and miniature wargames rules at the time, the sales dropped off quickly. Generally speaking, once a new game was released, anyone who was interested in the game would go out to buy it right away, so after a few months, sales would dramatically fall off. This is something Avalon Hill knew well, and why they had structured releases of games throughout the year. Unfortunately, Cavaliers and Roundheads was not out in time for Gen Con 1973, and sales also suffered due to a lack of budget from TSR for proper advertising. Not having generated the profit they were hoping from Cavaliers and Roundheads, and the estimated cost of printing rising, if TSR wanted to publish Dungeons & Dragons, Gygax and Kaye would need to find a new source of funds. As the scope of Dungeons & Dragons expanded from Gygax's initial vision of a single pamphlet into a 3-volume box set, the cost to print the game exceeded the initial budget. In a letter to Arneson dated January 13, 1974, Gygax estimated that this is going to cost us closer to $3,000 than $2,000, I believe, when boxes, separate charts, box labels, and advertising flyers are run. The art is costing us about $100 too. Gygax felt a growing pressure to release Dungeons & Dragons as soon as possible, partly due to his fears of competition from other games in development. Drafts of the playtesting rules had been circulating throughout Lake Geneva and the Twin Cities. Tony Bath published his Setting Up a Wargame campaign in 1973 with an overview of his Hyborian campaign and a supplement with rules for sword and sorcery wargaming, and there was a growing popularity of the Midgard family of postal games as early as 1972. If Gygax didn't publish Dungeons & Dragons soon, it would only be a matter of time before a similar game would break the market first, and Dungeons & Dragons could become the landlord's game to this monopoly. To avoid this, they could not wait on Cavaliers and Roundheads to generate a sufficient profit to fund the publication of Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax would need to secure additional funding to begin printing as soon as possible. Gygax and Kaye would find additional funding for TSR and printing Dungeons & Dragons from a fellow member of the LGTSA, local tool and die maker Brian Blume. Blume had a background in Avalon Hill board wargaming and strongly believed that the future of wargaming laid in the fantasy genre. In December 1973, Blume would invest $2,000 into TSR in exchange for equal partnership in the company. In an October 1975 letter from Gygax, he writes that the founders of TSR were Don Kaye, deceased January of this year, and myself. We were joined by Brian Blume about 2 months after we got started. According to Gygax, the structure of this 3-way partnership would be with Don Kaye is our wise and noble president, Brian Blume the watchful vice president, and I am the oppressed and hardworking editor. We capitalized the firm on a proverbial shoestring, and although we someday hope to make a small profit, every cent that comes in is immediately put right back into the company. Blume's $2,000 investment, along with the profits from Cavaliers and Roundheads, would be just enough to finance the printing of 1,000 copies of Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax would recall that 1,000 copies of the game were printed, and it took some 11 months to sell those first sets of D&D. Don Kaye, Brian Blume, and I staked the whole of our company on this venture, for it took every bit of capital we had to produce the game. We also spent hundreds of hours readying it to print, hours we could not spend on gaming, or with our families, or in pursuit of some other form of relaxation and enjoyment. It was long, hard work done late into the night and on the weekends. In light of the rising costs of printing D&D, due to the increasing scale of the game, Gygax was able to keep the cost of art low by commissioning local teenagers and family members to contribute art for the booklet interiors. One of these artists was a family member, Mary Gygax's half-sister Keenan Powell. Having just graduated from high school, she had no formal training in illustrations, but was a fan of fantasy literature. Powell drew her pieces between June and August 1973, providing a dozen illustrations. 10 were creatures that originally featured in the 1972 edition of Chainmail, and the other 2 were the Pegasus and Medusa. Powell would use the reference images found in her local library as inspiration for her pieces. The second primary illustrator for Dungeons & Dragons would be Greg Bell, mentioned earlier for his work on illustrations for TSR's Cavaliers and Roundheads. As Bell did not live in Lake Geneva, like Arneson, his collaboration with Gygax would be primarily done by post. As Gygax's plan for the game's art and production changed several times throughout 1973, much of Bell's work was done quite late in the publication process. In fact, as late as December 27, 1973, Gygax would write in a letter to Arneson, fearing that the cover art isn't in from Bell. Roughly 24 of Bell's illustrations would be published in Dungeons & Dragons, and some of the leftovers would be included in the first Dungeons & Dragons supplement. Greg Bell faced several challenges for the illustrations of Dungeons & Dragons. Beyond the short production timelines and distance from Gygax, most of his commissions were based on creating art for fantastic creatures that no one had ever seen before. Within these tight time restraints, and in unfamiliar territory, like Keenan Powell using inspiration from images in her local library, Bell found inspiration from comic books, most notably Marvel's Strange Tales number 167. His cover illustration closely follows a panel from the Doctor Strange story, This Dream, This Doom. The illustration for the end of Monsters and Treasures, showing a sorcerer standing in front of a flaming brazier, also draws several inspirations from that story. Nick Fury's pose in the segment titled Armageddon would be repurposed in the illustration for the Barbarian, and one of the last images in Underworld and Adventures. Many of Bell's other contributions can be traced back to similar sources. Powell and Bell would not be the only illustrators for Dungeons & Dragons. Arneson would also provide 4 illustrations: the Purple Worm, Hydra, Beetle, and a Dragon. One final piece would also be included: a picture of a werewolf's head, drawn by Gygax's childhood friend, Tom Keogh. Tom shared Gygax's love for horror and fantasy, and aspired to become an artist, but unfortunately died young. Gygax would include this piece as a gesture to him, and the game would be dedicated to him in memorandum. On December 30th, Gygax wrote to Arneson that the first order for 1,000 sets of the booklets should be printed in 3 to 4 weeks, and that they would start slapping labels on the boxes and send out some flyers soon. However, the printing schedule dragged on a bit, and Dungeons & Dragons took several weeks to print, as the 3 volumes had to be proofed, printed, and bound separately. This was all done manually, by hand, and primarily done by Gygax, his wife Mary, and their children. Just before the end of 1973, Gygax had the materials of Men in Magic printed at the local graphic printing company and stored them in Don Kaye's garage. They would also order the first shipment of wood grain boxes for the booklets and printed the labels that would be pasted to the boxes. The second volume, Monsters and Treasures, would be printed in mid-January 1974, and the final volume, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, would be printed shortly afterwards. On February 7th, 1974, Gygax wrote to Arneson that the printer has D&D nearly done, so your copy should be in the mail by next week. Sure enough, by the second week of February, the graphic printing company completed the last of the 3 pamphlets, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. Once the first 1,000 copies were available for sale, Gygax fully dedicated himself to spreading word of the game. TSR had a few other planned releases for 1974, but none in the same scope, scale, or potential profit-making venture that D&D proposed. Throughout 1974, Gygax would also try to convince Arneson to push sales of D&D as well. Most sales would end up coming through their distribution partners, but as they both shared a royalty agreement paying each Gygax and Arneson 10% of each sale, they both stood to gain more individual profit through direct mail sales than through their distributors. The game would cost $10, equivalent of $65 in 2025 money, a steep price for 3 pamphlets of rules for miniatures that would normally be given away for free. Combined with the generous royalty agreement, Gygax and Arneson stood to make a sizable profit from the sale of D&D. However, it remained to be seen if anyone would even buy it. Gygax had gotten over the initial hurdle of writing and printing D&D by the start of 1974, but the question of how successful the game would be was far from certain. In fact, more concerns were raised by its initial release and slow sales that would bring into question whether it had any commercial viability at all. Was the game teachable, marketable, desirable? The subtitle for the game promised rules for fantastic medieval wargame campaigns, playable with paper and pencil miniature figures, indicating that Gygax and Arneson at this point didn't even realize they had created an entirely new genre of game, role-playing games, and instead relied on the established market and genre of miniature wargames. Therefore, the release of Dungeons & Dragons would not be the entire story of its invention. Upon its release, it would necessarily need to find a new audience of gamers, and in turn, the scope of the rules and playstyle of the game would rapidly expand and diversify from the 3 pamphlets in the wood grain box. In the next 2 years, a community would form around Dungeons & Dragons and TSR, leading to a furious process of clarifying, correcting, and supplementing the rules of the game in a new direction. This community would wonder if fantastic medieval wargame campaigns accurately described the gaming practices contained within Dungeons & Dragons. We will dive more into this part of the story and the initial spread of D&D throughout 1974 in the next video. Thank you so much for watching the second episode of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. What do you think about the story of how Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson worked together to expand the rules of Blackborn Chainmail into the game of Dungeons & Dragons, or the collaborative efforts between Gary Gygax, Kaye, and Brian Blume to create Tactical Studies rules to publish Dungeons & Dragons? Let me know in those comments down below. In the next episode, we'll take a look at how Gygax worked throughout 1974 to spread Dungeons & Dragons and grow TSR. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot, and I will see you in the next video.